Artificial intelligence is probably one of the biggest technological shifts of our time. But for Africa, there's a big question, right? In that, are we going to simply consume AI that's built elsewhere across the world, or can we actually help to shape what the technology becomes? My guest today has spent a majority of his career working on that particular question. Professor Vukosi Marivate is a professor of computer science at the University of Pretoria, and he holds the ABSA UP Chair of Data Science. He leads the university's Data Science for Social Impact Research Group, and is also the director of the African Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. Beyond just the academia, he's co-founder of Lelapa AI, an African AI startup, chief investigator at the Masakani Research Foundation, and a co-founder of the Deep Learning Indaba, one of the continent's leading AI research communities. He also serves on the United Nations Independent International Scientific Panel on AI. Good afternoon, Prof. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's great to connect with you, and look forward to having a chat.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and congratulations on another edition of the Indaba. I think it's edition number 9, I believe. How was it in Lagos?
Oh, yeah. No, it would have been the 7th, because I think 2020 and 2021, unfortunately, we weren't able to have a physical Indaba. So it is 9 years later, but then this will be the 7th. Lagos is amazing. Sights, sounds, people, debates about AI discussions, and really getting into the depth of what African AI means. And at the same time, having some good jollo.
I want to start here, right? I mean, when the Indaba started in 2017, AI was, it wasn't a topic, to be honest. How did you have that kind of a foresight to say this technology is going to have quite like an impact? I think it's great that we start this kind of like initiative to really gather top voices in AI in Africa.
Thanks for reaching out in terms of thinking about that. So on one is, okay, like artificial intelligence as a field, go back decades. So you're 1950s, 1960s, and there might have been also references to thinking about this way of doing computing and math even earlier than that. So I think the thing you're more referring to is, if we think about the 2010 to 2015, one of the things that was happening in the field was the rise of kind of deep learning approaches and methods. So what this meant is that, okay, you can build bigger and bigger models, and with bigger models, and if you give them more and more data with specific frameworks and architectures, they get to do like very interesting kind of behavior. So the big one being at kind of the early days, like 2010 to 2012, was thinking about computer vision, that now you can build like very capable vision models that were very different from everything else that had been going on before when it comes to computer vision. Then later on, you start seeing on the language side a similar thing starting to happen, to say like, with these GPUs, we can keep on scaling these things, and they keep on, again, you're seeing this capability that you couldn't see before with different prior approaches. Now, this then for a number of us, so with me, I work with our co-founders of the Deep Learning Indaba, but there's Data Science Africa, there's Data Science Nigeria or Data Science Network, many other African organizations kind of see this on the horizon and then say like, how do we make sure that as these kind of revolutions are happening, that Africa shapes what happens to these technology, not that we just are told that we must just adopt them. And then when you just adopt them, they might not really be fit for purpose. They might not really capture what we believe is the opportunity that they have for our populations. We want to build them ourselves. So the Deep Learning Indaba really starts under that feeling of, we can do this ourselves. It's just that we're going to have to very quickly build up the capability and capacity across the continent to do this.
If you are to compare, when you guys started, the Indaba in 2017 to now, how much of the progress do you think we have made as a continent, especially around the research in AI? And, how much of the work is still has to be done in this field?
There's different ways to measure progress. So if we go back to Indaba 1, there was one way is how many people we've been able to support. So then you had 300 people coming to vets in Johannesburg in 2017. And then now, I think both the last two Indabas have been over 1,000 people, and probably something close to 3,000 people having applied. So the demand for a deep conference, workshop, community gathering is very high. I think there was a lot at the beginning of people thinking, no, this is not something that necessarily happens across the continent, right? You have a tech gathering that is very much deep on the research and development, right? It's not a user conference. It's not this thing of, oh, if you're a user of AI, here's our API or all of those things. No, no, no. It's about, hey, are you trying to do this in climate? Here's kind of where things are at the moment at the edge. Here's some things that people have been trying to do to go beyond that edge. And then what is it that you can kind of do? The other is, yeah, I think there's way more young people now who've been through this generation of having this community being available. As I said, it's not just deep learning in Daba, you have Data Science Africa, that they are now kind of becoming senior. They're out there, they're going off doing PhDs. Some have now already started their postdocs. And now you then go to the next question and say, like, okay, how do we make sure we absorb them into the continent as opposed to them necessarily all of them leaving? And that's where you've seen then very deep tech startups across the continent trying, right? A number of people, even myself, helping co-found a startup, have been doing that, of saying that we can do more and more research in this area, also in the kind of in the private sector as startups. And then you then create the next problem, right? Is now it's like, okay, how do these technologies now get absorbed by both the public and private sector, larger organizations? And then I think that's where we currently are. And some of the things that I took part in at the Deep Learning Indaba in Lagos, where these conversations with startup other founders, hearing like, yes, where our pains are, but then where also our opportunities and where we could share kind of knowledge on really breaking into having the technologies being built locally, actually making it into local organizations.
I've had, a privilege of having, like a look at, the research that's being, submitted for the Indaba, and it's really, really incredible. Do you think as a continent, I think, when it comes to R&D, we still have a challenge on the continent in that we are not seeing like a lot of like investment in there. Because I think, at the moment, like at the average, we are doing, like less than 1% of GDP on R&D. How do we kind of move that kind of the needle?
The one way you can think about it is, okay, who gets to really get the benefits of any technology at any time or scientific progress? And it's the people who are kind of ready for it or have systems that are built towards being ready for any technological or scientific change. And this is then connected to what you said. How much actually of our spend is on R&D in the country? And not just AI, but then across the board, whether you're in health, you're in climate, all of these types of things. So in South Africa, our benchmark is actually the National Development Plan. If you haven't read it, it's really worth reading in terms of how do you build a capable, really state and then really build for our people. And the benchmark there is 1.5% of GDP supposed to be around R&D. At the moment, South Africa is somewhere, I think, at 0.67. And we don't meet our own benchmark. And we also don't meet the lower benchmark, which is set by the African Union, which is at 1%. No African country actually meets that 1% bar. All right. And South Africa, in terms of just by quantum, not necessarily by percentage, we are the largest. So now what it means is that your planning for the future is kind of hobbled. Because what they say is that the best way to plan for the future is to actually invent it yourself, right? Because then you are the one who drives that piece. And if you are not doing that R&D compared to countries like the US, which uses, I think it's something like 3.6%, Singapore is like at 2%, and then I think I'm just trying to remember correctly, I might be wrong, but I think somewhere like Shenzhen in China is like over 5%, and 95% of that comes from the private sector. And these are some of the things. Like, over the last few years, having spent some time in different institutions, learning, I spent some time in Hong Kong, seeing what they were doing in science. And then you sit there and you're like, okay, do we think that the South African government is going to be able to double by itself this amount? No. Is it likely going to have to come from the private sector? Very much so. And it can't be that the private sector goes like, no. We first want to see that R&D actually improves our bottom line before we actually invest in it. Right, which yes, in some other countries that's what happened. Like the US, to get to its level, it means that what happened is that the US government for a while was the one driving the R&D spend, most of it, and then over time it becomes a bigger and bigger part of private companies. The reason the top 5 Fortune 500 companies that we're probably talking about were all in one way or another touching on AI, guess what? They have massive R&D budgets, right? Because they then can shape what's actually coming along and then try to make sure that if something comes in and they hadn't been necessarily actively investing in it, they can always increase those investments because it's part of the way that they kind of future-proof themselves. Why don't we have that locally? Why do we wait for other people to tell us that this technology is ready and not that we're testing ourselves? And then we can likely figure out other pieces of that technology that other parts of the world wouldn't necessarily care about.
Whilst we're still on this right now, what role do you think policy plays in really like trying to drive this conversation of saying we need to spend on the grassroots kind of like investment to be able to get this technology to work for us?
Yeah, why do we need the grassroots? So I work in language, especially with AI or natural language processing. Don't need AI necessarily to work on language. And in that case, the world has 7,000 languages. Many of them are not written. Many use scripts that are different to the ones that we write out. And as such, if you're then thinking, how do people get represented in these languages? It's not just going to be because a major player, a big country or a big company decided. It's going to be people saying, no, we want to make sure that our language or our culture is represented better. So we're going to do the work. And this is the thing that's at stake here. To keep on thinking that, no, somebody else will do it. It cannot be a sustainable way for the future. The way is to then have people having choice or agency and being able to choose how advances in technology, in science come into their communities. And for that to happen, they need to have the capability and capacity. And that's why I think it's so important.
I want to move like our conversation now to your area of specialty, which is NLP, natural language processing, right? I mean, it's very clear that like a majority of the African languages are like invisible to global AI systems, right? With regards to the work that you do at the Masakane Research Foundation, can you just give an audience an overview of where we are in terms of like inclusivity of the languages in Africa in AI?
So Masakane became like the first spin-off out of the deep learning endeavor. And I think I went on mostly like to help co-found it, but then worked a lot to mostly advise the board at the time. And it has kind of grown its own legs in many, many different ways. And it's now like, massive organization. And then it's also had its own spin out. One being you have the Masakane Research Foundation, which is more community driven and then really tries to bring people who are interested in African languages together. Then you have the Masakane African Language Hub. So what this hub is at almost like a grant maker. What this means is that it attracts funding and then it opens up opportunity to fund R&D in different ways around these spaces. So both of them have their own distinct place in the ecosystem. And then they also then work together, right? But they're all like, it's Masakane connected. But then I just want people to understand that part of it. Sometimes they'll be confused now with they'll say, hey, there's something called Masakane African Languages Hub and there's something called Masakane Research Foundation. Obviously, like, they will evolve. I think right now they're doing a call for new board members for the Research Foundation. So decisions will be made over the next few years and we'll see how it goes. But then what then happens? Like, how did it end up? Like, Masakane, I think it got like some initial startup capital for the grant making of something like $3 million, is that it had to show that you could bring people together, they can work on some languages and then change the way that a technology moves, right? And it could be done very much locally. There will be that balance between there'll be smaller innovators that need to be supported, and there'll be bigger innovators who say like, okay, there's different ways to scale. There's one of scaling hyper locally, saying that if the African continent is between 2,000 and 3,000 languages, very many of them are going to be really small. And there it's to enable the communities to be able to have the capability to work by themselves and do something about it. And then there's the languages that might be kind of closer at the top, who now you say like, oh, but here I can just scale by taking the more technology route of, hey, we've got enough data, we've got enough compute, we can do something about this, all right, in this way. These are two different ways, and there's probably somewhere in the middle that they meet. So the grassroots organizations help you now cover both, because the people who are then have the capability and the capacity to do the higher ones will do that. The ones who are very much more locally based on a smaller scale are also going to be there, and they'll be learning from each other. So even at the Deep Learning Indaba, there were workshops on language, and you could see these communities interacting with each other, sharing ideas, sharing knowledge, sharing like, what worked, what failed. And then you hope every year you keep on seeing these jumps. And then from those jumps, you can highlight these trajectories that are coming along in some of these spaces. The other side is that you also get to understand some of the limits. How do you work with communities in a sustainable and responsible way? These are discussions that are deeply happening in these research communities, because they know that for sustainability, they need to be equal partners with the communities, whether cultural or language that they represent. You don't just become an innovator or a technologist outside and then just say, oh, I'm serving this person. It's not just about scale, but it also is not sustainable. Like something will be very short-lived.
Just for context, right, can you provide like our audience like an overview of the data sets that's available for African languages on AI compared to the rest of the world?
So I think there's a number of metrics that people would use, but then in general, like, up until maybe like, a year or two ago, I think that number would have been that out of all the data sets that are out there that people are using, African data represents less than 1% of that data. Right, as I said, globally you have 7,000 languages, and African languages represent something like 2,000 of those languages. So if you use that, you're somewhere at what, 30%. But then, how much data there is, even though it's skewed towards Hausa, Yoruba, isiZulu, Swahili, is still less than 1%. And this is a major thing, because for a lot of people who build these LLMs, they just take these data sets that are already available. They're not necessarily going to go and say like, oh, I'm going to find more data for Chichewa or more data for Isindebele. They just take what's easy. So that's why English becomes so overrepresented, because it's easy to get English data comparatively to getting for an African language.
What risks do we run from this exclusion? I mean, apart from the fact that, every time I try to talk to ChatGPT, like in Setswana, I get like some gibberish. Apart from that, what risk do we run by not having that amount of the data set?
Our cultures then, or our local context, let me not just say culture or language, it's not enough, are not represented well. So now it might just be that somebody who might stay, let's say, here I'm using in a place that might be lowly represented in these models, makes a request in some of these models for their use case, right? I might be asking and saying like, I'm trying to do fish farming somewhere in Limpopo, right, where people speak Kilubedu, right? Their experience there might be very bad, right? And then we just might think, I live in a city in Pretoria, and think like, oh yeah, these systems work so well, but that might not be for those people.
I want to jump now to like an important topic, which is pipeline from the research to commercialization, right? There is not like a lot of research like in African AI, right? But what do you think is kind of block that really like prevents that like amount of the research from going to commercialization?
There's multiple things. I think one of the big discussion points at the Scaling AI kind of workshops and a couple of other things at the Deep Learning Indaba this year was just on how much of local procurement is set up to be able to absorb locally built technology, right? We sometimes think that, no, it's just the public sector that is slow. It's not effective in actually being able to take on new things. But you find even big private organizations, when they have to start interacting with startups, they are not set up to do it. It takes long to go through their procurement processes. They might be more risk averse. So the thing with R&D, right, is that you test out things by experimenting. So even when you are a startup, you're trying to say, yes, here's our technology, it's bleeding edge. And how do you create an environment where it can come into your organization? And as such, if the organizations are not set up to be able to set up their own small experiments and be able to test, everything just sits as pilots that are kind of using made up, maybe sometimes data or made up situations, but they never get to actually let's actually start pushing this into the hands of our customers. So that's the thing here that we're going to kind of need to think about in these spaces. At the same time, right now people might be talking about billions of dollars and trillions of dollars that are moving around being put into these areas, but only a fraction of that gets into the African continent. Can we have deep tech investment into the continent? Those are still very far and few between.
I want to get your own experience. You are the CTO of Lelapa AI. For those who don't know Swana, Lelapa, it means home. How was that transition from being like like in academia to now being like a part of a startup? I believe now trying to raise like a Series A. How was that entire experience in like kind of trying to move from academia to now like to a startup?
Yeah, I think on my side, just for context, is like we're very kind of different in some ways. Is that yeah, it's not necessarily, it was more building up on the experiences and the capabilities that you build for yourself, and then you bring together almost the same as in Indaba. You say, oh, we've got this joint knowledge that we have about how to do deep research, and then how then can you apply it to an area. So the area that we looked at was, we believe that for things like speech, for things like translation, they are very ripe for good R&D to make it into the hands of users, and that's what we've kind of been building towards. So that's been very important for us, and then we were able then to talk to a number of funders and then believe in the team and believe that we can do that R&D. Is it easy? No. Is it a straight line? No. And it comes with its own experiences, and I'm proud of what the team has been able to do, from the executive, the CEO, the CTO, the COO, CCO, to the researchers, the engineers, and it's something to be really proud of in being able to do these hard things, right? I think people just think like, oh yeah, all you're going to do is put up wrappers on things. No. To do it right, you need to build deep, and to build that depth takes time. It takes taking chances, and you just hope that kind of people come in and are able to support.
For the researchers who are trying to do that transition from the academia to like startups, etc., what is there like an investor like appetite for the AI startups?
I think there are many different things you can do. So some universities with their tech transfer offices are providing more and more pathways for people to test out. And it also might be that finding co-funders who are more entrepreneurial, if you are not. And then some of these then might also be able to engage with some of the local funding when it comes to getting the startups off the ground, right? So to some of the initial angel funding or seed rounds. I think a challenge that you find is that, like, if you're doing deep R&D work in a lot of deep learning at the moment, or Gen AI, if you want to go in that way, it's heavily compute intensive. So sitting there and then being able to say, okay, hey, we might need a company, sure, I need to pay salaries, but then it might just be that for a while, on paper, something like 60% of my money is used on GPUs running. That seems very, very scary, right, in these spaces. So then you will see that there's a lot of programs, maybe from some of the big players outside the continent, who then try to provide for founders to be able to get some of that compute. But then it's obviously not for nothing, right? They're wanting you to start using their platforms, and if you use their platforms, later on you'll convert into a paying customer.
I want to get now to like like a topic of talent. There's like a lot of talent, but like a lot of like opportunities are also present at these like big tech companies in the US and like in Europe. How do we try to retain our talent in AI like in Africa?
It's many things. As I said, like, it's not enough just to say, okay, we have good universities, great. We have good researchers, yes. Do we need to scale them? Yes. I would like 1,000 of me. Yeah, no, yeah. Like, people sometimes don't understand this. So I'm like, no, I want 1,000 of me. I don't want me. That's not enough, because you want an ecosystem that is building on itself, right? Because if you do that, then the work just becomes much, much higher quality. And you've seen that the same thing with the deep learning in Daba. If we go back to the first poster research sessions at VET in 2017, comparing it to what we just saw last week in 2026, it is crazy, right? And why has it been? Is because researchers have found this place they can come to every year on the continent, show each other work, debate, and then it keeps on increasing the quality just because you are around excellence. Right now, you start going and you push yourself in that space. But then now, if then people finish their masters, their PhDs, their postdocs, and they don't have spaces that actually challenges them, keeps them sharpening those skills, they then have to make a choice. And a lot, it's not enough just to say, I'll join the private sector, be like, sure, I'm working on AI, but I'm actually not building anything. I might just be babysitting somebody else's models. And then they leave, right? So, and some parts of this has been now this thinking that it's not also just about kind of brain drain. It's about how do we move towards brain circulation? That yes, if people are out and they're out there and they leave the continent, how do we make sure we keep connected? Some of them might come back. I came back as I did my PhD in the US for about 5.5 years, enjoyed my time there. But then, you looked at South Africa and I said, like, I think there's an opportunity here. And I think I'm very thankful for the deep learning Indaba community, the Masakane community, because I got my outlet to being able that, we can actually do these things here.
At the moment, there's this kind of like a debate, like in the US about, like open weight versus, like closed source models, right? When you come back home to Africa, where do you think we are in terms of like AI's sovereignty and, how do we kind of like try to improve our position? Because I feel like the world is having like a different kind of conversation and we are still trying to figure out whether like I prefer Claude or ChatGPT.
So it's a big thing. And I think maybe my definition here of sovereignty is having the agency or freedom of choice, that you can choose for what technologies and scientific progress, output you want to be able to build up your capacity and capability for yourself locally, and then what you might be able to take from somebody else. So it is a stark reality to go in and say, like, when the world was having this debate about open weight or closed weight, and it really should be open source. It should not just be open weight. We really want to know what's in the data. We should understand how training was done. So that's also a misnomer. So when people just, it's an open source model. No, if we don't know what the data is. We need to know what the data, we need to know a lot of design choices that were made, and that you see that most of the world is kept out of those conversations. So it's not just Africa, might be South America, Asia, right? It's almost like, it's only the big people who are there, because that conversation is sometimes coached in mostly about concentration of power, right? Somebody might have been saying, I sell my model, which is completely closed, for a specific amount of money, and I want to protect that. So I don't want people to be talking about open models, right? And then somebody else might say, no, I can level the playing field. In, again, the people who have the compute, the engineers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of engineers, they're saying, no, we go for open weight models because it levels our competition ground. But for most of the world, their voices are not being heard. And some of this, as I said, being things like, we want to know what's the data, right? If you're making a claim that our model now supports X amount of African languages, and we can't see the data, we might not understand what the limitations actually of your model in that language is. For example, there's a lot of language data for African languages that is mostly religious. Yeah. And that is very skewed. That is not necessarily giving you a view of the world in all of its complexity. And then it's just giving you one slice.
And there's also the proverbs and the idioms which get really complex in African languages, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. There's more here that we have to think about in these spaces. And it is not just to kind of listen to maybe the most powerful and the most loud, but then it's also to create a space that even smaller players can make their own choices. That's what, for me, sovereignty means. It is not that, if we're just told, no, don't do anything. You should only listen to the most powerful, and they're the ones who are going to tell you what to do. We're all going to be the worse for it.
Whilst we're still on the topic of the sovereignty, I think it also brings us to a topic of the geopolitics of AI, that, AI is going to become, like a powerful kind of like technology. So we need to ask ourselves, where do we stand? Like what kind of the bargaining power do we have as a continent in this? And how do we kind of like create a strong position in that?
I think there's different things. Maybe if you think about you can always shape how technologies come into your country. There's many things. We have privacy requirements, data sovereignty requirements, all these things that you don't necessarily need new laws. You just need to be able to enforce them and say, like, no, we want your systems to be explainable to a specific extent, that if a decision is made on somebody, that is as transparent as possible and people understand. And sure, a lot of the times, and I think maybe where your question is coming from, is people will point to the EU because they can act as a single economic bloc and say all of our EU countries, as soon as we agree kind of on a policy, it's then everywhere, and it gives us those numbers, right? And now techno companies then have to then say, no, either I want to be in the EU or not. And there's still a long way to go for the continent to get to something that looks like that, even if we have the African Union. For example, we have the Malabo Convention, which is like Africa's version of GDPR, which was signed in 2014, and we're 10 years later, and you only have I think less than 15 African countries have ratified it, meaning they changed their local laws to match that Malabo Convention. South Africa hasn't changed our POPIA law to match it. you see how that becomes a challenge, because then people can then choose and say like, oh, I have this country seems to have more protections. For me to comply, it would take me more money. So I will then just not offer a service there. And I'll go to the other countries that don't have that type of legislation. And then that becomes a part that the bargaining goes away. At the same time, when we were part of the like helping out with inputs into the African Union Development Agency's white paper on AI, it really highlighted of saying like, no, let's not really necessarily write a policy, but then let's create a document that assists African countries in being able to choose and pick what becomes important for them, and then be able to now change their local laws given this AI moment that is there. And this is going back to like 2021, 2022. So it's not that African countries have been sitting and doing nothing, but we need to then always be continually saying, how can we make it better?
As we close off our conversation now, I want to look more like into the future. I mean, you had kind of like foresight to be able to come up with the, like Indaba way back in 2017, right? So now, like, I want to get like your outlook. How do you think, AI is going to change on the continent in the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
I think maybe the thing that excites me is just seeing the amount of young people who are getting into seniority. And that then means there's probably a path that I cannot foretell. I cannot tell you this is what's going to happen because it's not me. The spaces that I am at, that I will be able to share my experiences. But then what's coming is a supremely talented base of young people who are really doing amazing work. And I hope that people here listening and out there give them that opportunity to really test themselves and build up, as much of the African ecosystem as possible.
And then, like apart from the regulation conversation, what do you think needs to change for Africa to really scale in AI meaningfully?
You must believe in ourselves and believe in what we can build. It cannot be that we're always looking outside. We must support the local builders and find ways that we give them that space to try.
Where do you think a majority of the opportunity is going to be, like in AI? Is it going to be like in fintech, in healthcare, like in education, government, etc.?
When it comes to government, I always, for me, I've said for years, government just must make sure that its bases and foundations are strong. How does data move around? How is governance inside data that needs to be open? What needs to be closed and protected? Those types of things. While it comes to the other spaces, yes, there's opportunities in health, in agriculture, in many of these spaces, but these are not things we're going to get for free. We need to build for them.
I really, really appreciate your time, Prof. I believe this is like an important conversation that like the audience is going to find like a lot of value from.
All right. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Cheers, Prof.
Bye.